Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the LREF Investment Summit, with our topic over the next hour focusing on the West Midlands and delivering in partnership. My name is Katie Kopec and I lead the Strategic Development Consulting team at JLL, dealing with large mixed-use regeneration projects across the UK and globally, many of which are involved in partnerships between the public and private sector. Just a little bit of housekeeping. We want this to be as interactive as possible, so please use your Q&A function to be able to post questions to the panelists in order that we can give the full responses, and I'll do my very best to make sure I get round to you all. I have a great panel this afternoon. Neil Rami, CEO of West Midlands Growth Company, Pete Gladwell, Head of Public Sector Partnerships at L&G, Carl Potter, the Principal and MD at Avison Young, and Clare Wildfire, the Global Practice Lead for Cities from Mott, MacDonald. Before I hand over to Neil, a couple of interesting infobites. The region's economy has grown 25% in the last 5 years and 39% in the last 10. The region has maintained its position as the leading location for foreign direct investment outside of London and the southeast. And that whilst COVID has impacted many of the West Midlands core sectors, there are signs of resilience. And please God, with the Commonwealth Games in 2022, the focus on the region and the spotlight and the benefits of being in that spotlight should be a timely aid to recovery. Neil, over to you for your statement.
Thank you, Katie, and good afternoon, everyone. So yes, I'm Neil Rami. I'm the Chief Executive of the West Midlands Growth Company. We are the strategic investment agency for this part of the world. I will give you a bit of an update on where we are as a region and the particular implications and our focus from a real estate perspective. For those of you who don't know the region, it's quite a large region. We've got about 4.6 million people, a very young population, estimated to grow by about 500,000 over the next 50 years. As Katie has already said, we've seen pre the pandemic considerable economic growth as a region, and that coupled with our population projection means that we have significant housing needs and challenges, as well as, of course, the need to provide employment and amenities. But this, of course, creates very real opportunities for those in the development sector.
I think we may have lost Neil. I think we'll give Neil a little bit longer, but in the meantime, why don't we kick off with some of the questions that I know that we're going to follow. And I think that one of them is really about the sector's, the region's sector strengths. And I think one of the things is always important is to be able to articulate those strengths and the region's competitiveness, especially in the time of such a large amount of change, and how we compare in the West Midlands against other regions in the UK. So, Carl, perhaps I could ask you to answer that first question. Obviously, we haven't heard necessarily all of Neil's sector discussion that he was going to highlight, but I'm sure we can work without that. Over to you, Carl.
So, Neil, I'm sorry if I'm going to steal some of your limelight here, but I think it's fair to say the West Midlands has got a strong exposure to a number of key growth sectors. And since the global financial crisis, output growth in the region, as measured by GDP, has been greater than any of the UK regions outside of London. So we've got a really good backdrop pre-pandemic for where we were. That was a really very interesting 10 years in the history of the West Midlands. And that growth was quite phenomenal, particularly when you compare it to past growth in the region pre the last crisis. One of those examples, and if we talk about sectors, is the professional and private services sector. Now that already accounts for about 25% of regional output. And that again is greater than any UK region outside London and the South East. We have a larger share of GVA in that sector. But you look at the traditional strengths of the region, and in particular, the manufacturing sector. That continues to play a really crucial role in the regional economy. This is no longer metal bashing. This is real leading edge and innovative development. And if you look at electric vehicles being made for the Chinese in Coventry, this is where the heart of the next industrial revolution is happening already. And the importance of this sector to building back better really shouldn't be underestimated. And it's this exposure actually that has caused the region now, as you say, to be affected from the pandemic more than others. But it's a sector with significant bounce back prospects. You may, for example, have seen the excellent results that JLR announced earlier this week. And it's the continued innovation in this market, electric vehicles, autonomous vehicles, battery storage, that will be critical to deliver growth as we move forward. And some of you may have heard about the Brexit issues, about rules of origin and the difficulties that Marks and Spencer's has had delivering sweets from Germany back to Germany. Well, this applies to a lot of the products we make in the UK now. And we have to remember that, for example, by 2026, all electric vehicles produced in the UK, and that may be a significant amount from 2026 onwards, must originate their batteries from within the UK. So from a standing start, we've really got to get rolling into what we do with gigafactories and all those things. And this is really very interesting stuff. Looking back at the last crisis, exposure to manufacturing and automotive industry was seen as a weakness for the West Midlands, but actually it ended up as being a strength. And whilst the sector faces challenges, we think that this is going to be the same again for those reasons. And this time around, we don't think that deglobalization should be forgotten. The move towards supply chain resilience, onshoring, bringing back supply chain manufacturing and assembly back to the UK is really going to help to consolidate that growth within the regions. And those sectoral regions are the underlying factors that has driven our healthy economic performance so far. We are a destination as we move forward for large infrastructure projects like HS2, and we'll have a major opportunity from the structural green energy transitions. The West Midlands does have some weaknesses, and one of those that's been highlighted is life sciences, but with Bruntwood SciTech, now committed as University of Birmingham's development partner at the Birmingham Life Sciences Park, a significant and innovative first phase that matches the collaborative space, incubation corporate facilities are going to start to drive that growth in the Midlands. And you'll have seen in recent announcements that there's a real shortage of accommodation in that sector. So I hope that helps giving you some of the sector inputs.
That's really, really helpful. And Neil, I see you're back in the room, the virtual room. And I wonder if you'd like to pick up from where you left off. Obviously, you heard what Carl had to say. There may be some duplication, but for that, we'll have to go with it. Thanks a lot, Neil. Over to you again.
Thank you, Katie, and apologies, folks. I'm not quite sure what happened there, but yes, Carl and I work very closely together, so I'd be surprised if we weren't on the same page. But just briefly, I think, like every region, the West Midlands has been hit hard by the pandemic. The figures are fairly obvious, but the recovery plan is really predicated against three things. We sort of made the cut when it came to public infrastructure pre-pandemic. So with HS2 and various other infrastructure investments, that is driving growth. The trade deal and the EU transition arrangements have supported the development of our manufacturing base. And as Carl says, the spotlight will be very firmly be on the West Midlands with City of Culture this year and the Commonwealth Games, which is attracting quite a lot of global attention. What I really wanted to focus on today was our net zero ambitions, and the West Midlands Combined Authority has set out a 2041 ambition for net zero for the region. And our regional policy is pretty straightforward in terms of building back better. We want that to be physical, logistical, economical and social. And there's a number of ways that we plan to do that. The first and most relevant, I guess, today is to deliver viable housing on brownfield sites and to protect where we can our green belt. And outside of our three key cities of Birmingham, Coventry and Wolverhampton, we need to challenge development viability. So I have to say our West Midlands Combined Authority has been very successful over the last 12 months in securing significant amounts of central government funding to support this kind of development. So we secured something like 24 million of the total 40 million of the National Brownfield Housing Fund last year. In fact, I think it was 27 million the year before. And in total, I think I'm right in saying the region has something like £500 million of devolved housing and land funds now available for eligible schemes. So we're really quite focused on this area. And secondly, we aim to be the UK centre for MMC, and I know we're going to talk about that today. We secured 15 million just before Christmas from government for the National Brownfield Institute, which really will focus on three things: research and development, skills in the sector, and how we pilot new financial models around viability. And we are asking Mr. Sunak in this budget for some additional funding to bridge the viability gaps that we see in terms of residential development. As Carl said, there's also a very clear focus on what the future of work will look like for this region. And ironically, the four market opportunities that we identified pre-pandemic have in fact become more important as a consequence of the way people are working. And that's in the areas of smart mobility, data-driven healthcare, creative technologies, and modern business services. So the final point I wanted to make really was we are very aware of the challenges on our city centres, like every city centre across the UK. In fact, Pete and I are on a session later on today to look at Wolverhampton, Birmingham and Coventry, and we're being quite bold actually in how we can leverage our public assets and make more of our anchor institutions. And I think watch this space, you'll see some new models coming out of the West Midlands in terms of investment. So I've sort of truncated my opening, Katie, but I think that covers the key points.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. And you point out about the strength in MMC, and Pete, I know you've done a lot of work on the housing front, and also I'll be really interested to hear from you about the types of partnerships and deals that you are doing to deliver that, and particularly on the sort of green growth agenda, which also Neil mentioned a bit. Perhaps I could ask you to cover those points.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me along this afternoon. I think, I mean, housing's an interesting one. You'll know LNG has its own modular factory, and that is all driven by this desire to bring longer term investment into housing. Neil mentioned this phrase viability that drives me nuts, because it's all predicated on this very outdated assumption that if you want to get houses built, you've got to make a 15 or 20% short-term profit. If you can't get that, it's unviable. No one's building anything. And sure, that's how many of the kind of old school home builders might work, but it's just not fit for purpose for us as a society. And I think we're seeing not just LNG, to give credit, lots of others, particularly housing associations, bringing much longer term, more patient investment into the space that needs a 4% return, over 30 years, rather than being caught up on these kind of traditional viability metrics. The point of saying all that is this longer term investment actually isn't taking the kind of same short-term sales model. It's much more of a kind of long-term income model. And so suddenly generating income from housing and getting it built quickly, it becomes really important to us. That's where housing factories start to stack up, because suddenly you are literally looking to bring forward 400, 500 units at a time, so you can get the income generated to pay people's pensions with it. It's a very different approach. If I'm frank, I feel like there's still more we can do with that model in the West Midlands. Yeah, a couple of housing associations are deploying it, but there's still more we want to do, working with the Combined Authority and some of the local authorities to try and bring the benefits of it that we've been able to use elsewhere, including, by the way, in providing housing for homeless families and fantastic things like that, where again the kind of traditional short-term profit models just don't work. So that's a real model, I think, for us as an industry and society, and you know, coming out of this to explore. The other one, as you mentioned, Katie, is really around green growth, and you know, LNG's just published its roadmap to get to net zero. It's not just a commitment now; we've even published this roadmap about how we intend to get there. But that is one of those, you know, I think Carl mentioned it earlier, that, you know, we need to think about gigafactories. We need to think about retrofitting homes. Actually, you know, we are the we in this situation. The industry is going to be the people who solve this. And I think, Neil, I'm worried I saw you last week on another thing about this. Did I as well? Anyway, clearly Neil and I are kind of following each other around the country virtually. But the point in all of this is actually, certainly on things like retrofitting housing, the solutions already exist. This isn't something where we need, you know, magic rainbow tech. People can already do this for about 20, 30 grand a home. LNG is very happy to fund it. It's a long-term investment. It generates savings on energy bills. It's actually an unusual investment that generates income. So it's great for pension funds. But it is going to need this really kind of collaborative approach between us, the public sector, you know, scaling up the huge amounts of local talent and expertise to get this delivered if we're going to see it roll out. So I suppose the plea for me is just, you know, to recognize that each one of us is going to have to step up coming out of COVID. You know, it's going to require us as an industry to work collaboratively, be really open about what our strengths are, what our weaknesses are, what we can each contribute, and moving beyond this kind of, you know, very tired, oh, I'm going to procure from a list of 10 people, to think, well, look, what's the right role that each of us can play in addressing this, you know, massive social need for investment coming out of COVID.
Absolutely fundamental, and the whole green thing is so important. I mean, you know, the built environment contributes something like 30% of all the damage. So we as an industry have got to stand up and help save the planet for our kids and our kids' kids. So I absolutely think it's so fundamentally important, and we have a real opportunity now to make a real step change out of all of this, because it's what everybody is saying, and it's really important. And quite honestly, we would be failing ourselves and the next generations if we don't all individually step up and do our own bit. But I'll get off my hobby horse about this, but I think it's really important. And I think that brings us on again, actually, to another question that I've got. And I'm not seeing any questions coming in from the audience, so please don't be shy. I can master the technology, I promise you. So I think traditionally we've always measured success in sort of economic growth terms, but how we emerge from this pandemic in what I hope, and I'm sure everyone else hopes, for a kinder, greener, fairer, faster way to grow. What measures are needed to recognise this, and who's going to deliver those? Claire, perhaps I can come to you for that.
Perfect, thank you. And this segues really well from Peter's points about, well, starting with what I'm going to do is unashamedly plug a piece of work that we've just finished as part of the UK Net Zero Infrastructure Industry Coalition. And that is a coalition that we created to bring the industry knowledge into this space from precisely that point, which is we hold some of the answers and there's enough knowledge that's already out there for us to begin this journey. So this piece of work that we've done is looking at the city scale transition to net zero. And we brought together both national and local government, but also the private sector in some of the conversations with the energy and transport sectors. And it was co-led by Leeds City Council and supported by the West Midlands Combined Authority. But the outcomes are equally as applicable, not just to the net zero agenda, but to the faster, greener, fairer recovery. And what we found was that there are more opportunities in the place-based approach than is currently being exploited by the national agenda. Because if you get a more granular view of the local local opportunities and challenges, but also the enthusiastic local investment, where the risks are, what where the money flows can be, that's how you can create the attractive conditions for the locally applicable solutions, those that wouldn't otherwise be visible to the market. So this isn't just a government sort of stimulating top-down mandate that market responds to. You can create the layer in the middle if you bring together the various players that are interested in creating local solutions. So our report had 4 recommendations, 4 Ps: power, people, the digital platform element, that's the use of systems level data for decision making. But for this this point here, most importantly, about partnerships and different sorts of partnerships. So between local authorities, so that they can collaborate to move forwards together, between local and national government, with communities, but specifically on the public-private sector collaboration and partnerships. What we began to see is this is a very complex and interdependent space where we're looking at how the health agenda links with the transport agenda and active travel and the energy and net zero agenda. So if you're creating solutions in that sort of incredibly complex space, there's a need for a really careful curation of trust in both directions between public and private partnerships. So understanding, the starting point being, what does it look like to be in the other person's shoes? What does good look like? What does it look like on the other side of the fence? And there's some really good examples of where that was the starting point for some really successful collaborations and sort of building on each other's strengths. But equally, where that time hasn't been taken, the hope that you can generate a win-win situation is much harder to make happen. So I'm just going to finish with 2 examples from West Midlands, or loosely West Midlands, of where we've seen or where we were able to extract case studies. So one is Black Country Transport, which is the consortium of Wolverhampton, Sandwell, Dudley and Walsall to move forwards the electric vehicle opportunity. And so, as well as combining goals and action plans and public engagement, so bringing benefits, it's sort of not just the jobs and the net zero agenda, but also cost savings due to reduced damage cost. What that collaboration also brings is the consistency in approach that allows the private sector to be able to reduce the risk cost and also help their scale up. And then the last example is a collaboration between the energy provider Engie and the town of Rugeley, where they've collaborated together so that Engie is bringing sort of low carbon solutions, not just to the Rugeley power station development red line boundary, but they're looking beyond that to the town of Rugeley, because that trusted partnership conversation is happening. So I'll take a deep breath and stop there.
Thank you, Claire. That's really, really interesting. We have had some a question in from Stuart from ING Media, and I'm going to address this to Neil. The West Midlands Combined Authority have a large amount of public land assets at their disposal and have been discussing the need to make more efficient use of them while increasing the quality for local communities. How can the region use their underloved spaces better? Neil.
Thanks, Katie. I think it's a great question, Stuart. It's a very live conversation, as you would expect, as I'm sure it is in other parts of the country. I think, to be honest, there's a range of things that we need to consider. The first is meantime uses. So we've perhaps left sites unloved, as it were, and there's lots of things that we can be doing with those sites. An example is the Commonwealth Games. We will be using many of these sort of somewhat underloved spaces for community-led activities, and I think hopefully that will give us a template to roll out examples of this elsewhere. I think the net zero commitment is something that's really exercising our mind in terms of tree planting. There's even a national park plan for the West Midlands, which is hugely exciting. We are talking to developers about taking a broader kind of corporate responsibility, as it were. So whilst it might not necessarily be a sort of Section 106 commitment or a SIL commitment, The idea being that we have an open conversation around how we could use some of these spaces. But the final point, which I sort of touched on, I think I'm scared to use the term viability now with Pete around, but I thought perceived viability, but targeting very focused public resources to remediation, infrastructure and public realm improvements in some of these sites that frankly have been laid derelict for decades, not just years, is very much a focus of the West Midlands Combined Authority. And I guess because of the pandemic, this has really exercised people's minds, and great question, something that I think is a very live conversation at the minute.
Yeah, I think that whole value question is, as opposed to viability, is a really interesting question, because one of the things that I'm really interested in understanding is how do we capture the other values, the social values, the environmental values? How do we make sure, because if you get those right, then actually the sort of financial viability tends to follow. So, you know, I think it's really important. And do you see ways, and I'm going to pose this to Carl, ways of ensuring that everybody has their steps up to the responsibility that we've just talked about in delivering more than just the financial returns, but something much broader, contributing to the communities in which a lot of these development schemes are being developed out?
Thank you, Katie. I think it's a really, really important, very pertinent question. You know, what does building back better mean? How do we go about it? And I think to a large extent, the pandemic has given us all a cause to take a step back and to think about why rather than what we do. And, you know, what is our purpose? And I'll give you two examples of where this is quite pertinent across the West Midlands. And one of them was a piece of work that Avison Young ourselves were involved in, and that was for the Combined Authority and for all the local authorities within the region, to try to define what affordable housing actually meant. And you might look at that question and say, well, Brexit means Brexit. Yeah, but it's not about what is affordable housing. It's what does affordable housing give you as a region that is the purpose of achieving it. And we went through that exercise, and the West Midlands now has a really good framework for defining what type of affordable housing should be delivered and what is the outcome of that delivery. And the second example I'll give you is one that Neil may be able to talk more about, but the Combined Authority now has a checklist, an approach, a book about how it will expect its housing delivery partners to work with it. And all of that is based upon the concept of ESG and what it delivers back to the region.
Thanks a lot. That's really Claire.
Thank you. Is that okay to use my
You can use
hand?
whatever you want. That's fine.
Thank you. So to build on that, I think one of the things, so back to the point I made about the digital agenda, is the ability to get a better handle on what our communities value. And I think even people themselves will have been surprised at how that landscape has changed slightly. But what the digital agenda brings is the ability to help people see what's important to them. And I have an example from the other side of the world, from Auckland, where what we were doing was helping the local authority with their wastewater system. And in that sort of prediction of wastewater system capacity, we were able to link that to citizens' understanding of the quality of the water around the beaches, because there was that interdependency. And because it became a sort of digital application type solution, we were able to make the connection in their minds between the quality of the things that they valued and the wastewater treatment capacity, such that they were interested in increasing taxes in order to go towards increasing the capacity of the wastewater system. And I've slightly garbled that, but effectively it created that interaction between what the community wanted and the win-win with what the local authority wanted to happen. And that happened through the digital agenda.
That's really, really interesting. Pete.
Sorry, I've had a laptop for 10 years and finally last week got a new one, which is very exciting, but I no longer know how to use my mute button. So sorry, I got there in the end. Yeah, Katie, I just think this for us as an industry at the moment is absolutely where it's at. It's this, because we still persist with this idea. It's a bit like the old viability thing. We still persist with this idea that our industry exists to just make shed loads of money and then maybe give a bit of money back to some good causes. You know, if we've made enough money that we can afford to kind of chuck some off the side, and it's so exposed, I think, by this pandemic. But also it's just not going to be where we see long-term success. Certainly for companies like LNG, just commercially, it doesn't make any sense, because we need to be generating very long-term income streams, and we need to create assets that society needs for the next 40 years. If we're having any hope of receiving an income for the next 40 years, you know, you only have to look at, you know, mainstream record shops to see the disadvantages of creating assets that society didn't really need after a short period of time. So actually, coming out of this is why I hope I'm going to be able to communicate. This is why collaboration with the public sector is so essential, because if we're going to invest the literally tens of millions of pounds that LNG stewards, that belongs to the people of Wolverhampton, back into Wolverhampton to meet their need for investment, we can only know where that need is by working collaboratively with the council. There's no way I personally know the need for investment in Wolverhampton, or the social need, or how I can build buildings that Wolverhampton really needs. It's going to be the council who can tell me that, and other community groups, not just the local authority. But then if I can meet that social need for investment, commercially, that's the best thing for me as well, because that's what will generate long-term income, which is what I can use to pay pensions with in the next kind of 20, 30, 40 years. So it's putting this kind of social need and creating thriving communities at the heart of the business model, not as a kind of, well, I better give something back now because I've made so much money on my yuppie flats, you know, kind of model. And that feeds into both the things Neil was talking about the kind of viability of sites, but also it's a totally different way, I think, of us working with local authorities. And I don't want to go on about LNG, but I think we are modelling that in, you know, Sunderland, Sheffield, Newcastle, Bristol. There's lots of places, Oxford University even, where there's that collaborative partnership.
Thank you. That's great. Another question from Joshua Dennis. How can the Midlands, particularly 3 key cities, offset the accelerated impacts of the pandemic on the retail sector? Are there particular areas of redevelopment, repurposing which have been identified, i.e. last mile logistics, which has traditionally struggled to compete with other asset classes for urban centre locations? Neil.
Can I have a go at that?
You may indeed, by all means.
I was going to actually sort of connect it to some degree to Pete's comments, because I do think there's a collective challenge here. I mean, one of the challenges that I find in the retail, in the real estate sector, is that we get fixated with asset classes and we don't think across, across communities. And obviously, we've been looking a lot at the notion of 15-minute communities and what they mean, and as well as our 3 city centres, we've also got a number of town centres, which, you know, ironically were quite challenged pre-pandemic, and suddenly have sort of found a different chutzpah as a consequence of some of the issues that we're all facing. So I think there are different issues in this question. Inevitably, in terms of our big retail emporiums, there is a need to reconfigure and rethink in terms of what they mean to our communities quite quickly. It's well documented. We've lost a number of very large brands, and from my perspective, these need to be much more community centres with health facilities, with facilities that operate, possibly 24/7. We're talking to Esport Arena developers and so on. So, you know, you're talking about very big pieces of real estate with a lot of money invested in it. And I think rethinking how that could work in a community sense is important. But the last mile point, I think, is a really important point. And I think from a West Midlands perspective, we do need to think more about hubs and spokes. And at a very practical level, we are very concerned about, you know, 20 years ago, Birmingham had virtually no independence. We now have 6 Michelin starred restaurants. We've got an amazing food offer. We've got some incredible independence. Our concern for them is getting through the pandemic and coming out the other side. So we are going to have to be quite radical, I think, in terms of, in a real estate sense, how we support them. And that, I think, brings us full circle to Pete's point that, you know, from an investment perspective, if investors are going to take a longer term view and perhaps a slightly different financial perspective, they need to be part of this conversation. It's not just about a residential conversation over here and a retail conversation over there.
I think that's a really fair point. I mean, the whole opportunity that exists, and I think it is an opportunity about, in some cases, using the repurposing to re-enliven our city centres with different uses and different combinations of uses. We often see in quite a lot of our city centres where the core is actually quite, you know, it's quite vacant because there aren't very many people living anymore in that core. So the urban living and the opportunities that some new sectors provide to re-enliven people who are actually going to be living above the shop. I remember that a long time ago. You know, these things are really, really important because they're actually what people want to see. And there is another question here. West Midlands has been leading area around BTR sector. How does the panel think it could build on this growth, in particular around reimagining retail in post-COVID recovery? Thanks, Tracy, for that.
Katie, do you want me to come in and just say a few words about that? It's quite an interesting and really topical piece of question. Obviously, BTR is a type of residential. And the interesting thing about residential development now is there are so many different models. And as Pete says, previously, everybody just looked at what profit can I make very quickly before I escape. Yeah, that is, to a large extent, only one of the models available now. And there are many. And to regenerate town and city centres, you need to use a variety of models. You need to use every toolkit you've got, different types of tenure and different approaches. The problem with retail is twofold. One is density and the other is value. The value of retail premises is all about the ground floor. You know, in fact, it's all about the first 7 meters of the ground floor to a large extent. The upper floors have very little value. And therefore, repurposing retail has to take into account, you know, where is the value of it? How densely is it being developed? That single story, you know, retail, if there is no value in the retail element, is very much ripe for demolition and redevelopment. And that redevelopment has to come back in a dense format. So you get active use of the ground floor, but you make use of a lot of space above that ground floor. And that's the key to regeneration, is making sure that you use those two component parts to your best value.
Absolutely agree with that. And there is another question, which I think we've touched on, but it's a bit more blunt. How does ESG play into the West Midlands development and recovery plans? Is there anyone that wants to take that one first?
I suppose, sorry, Katie, maybe I wasn't clear, but that's what I was trying to say, is that actually I'm moving away from ESG playing a part to actually addressing social need at the heart of what we're doing is how we're going to kind of recover, whether that's green growth or, you know, different tenures of housing, as Carl was talking about, or, you know, investing to regenerate cities and town centres, and will be led by community and local authorities as to what that looks like. I mean, the thing I should just add, because I think Claire's really bang on with this, is, you know, the digital, what we're doing work with MPC and Built ID in Bristol, and there's a lot around the data side now where you can listen to voices in communities that otherwise wouldn't be picked up, and there's some really interesting. I think it's one area where PropTech has really established its value around all of that. So that gives you a whole new angle into areas of communities that otherwise we as kind of investors might not otherwise have had a chance to reach out to before.
Neil.
Can I just make one other point, because it sort of gets lost sometimes in this conversation around fair or good growth. Some of the basic fundamentals of how we sort of plan our places, we shouldn't forget, because we're all trying to get very clever about new financial models and everything else. Connectivity for me remains absolutely key, and despite the fact we're all sat here I'm in my glorified garden shed and you're in your front room by the looks of it, Katie, connectivity, both physical and digital, is undoubtedly the most important way of giving people opportunities, be it employment opportunities, amenities, and so on. And as I said right at the very start, I think one of the reasons I believe that this is still a highly developable and a strong investment opportunity as a region is because we sort of made the cut on some of those very large public investments on infrastructure, not just High Speed 2, and clearly the 2 stations in themselves are an opportunity, but the secondary investments in extension of our metro. We're now looking at light rail being sort of developed in Dudley and trialed in Coventry and so on. That connectivity is important. But the other point that I think Pete was alluding to was really around digital connectivity.
Yeah.
And what we're seeing is digital poverty becoming a massive issue for us at the moment. It's scandalous, frankly, that we can be living in a society where kids are sharing their parents' mobile phones. And we as a region, we're very committed to this. We were the first test pilot. We got something like 50 million together for public and private funds for the 5G investment, and we've now got much better connectivity. But I think that's only really the start of that. And from my perspective, this issue of connectivity, it will remain as one of the most fundamental issues for our society in terms of fair or good growth. And
what I can think about this is using that the digital and the communicating this to the citizens is you can be able to articulate the resilience of that spend. So like you say, you're creating the resilience by making that choice. So it's no longer just one way of accessing something. You've got the proximity and the digital and the original transport. And that for citizens is we're now able to put a value on long-term resilience in a way that we've never been able to before, because people couldn't really comprehend what failure looked like. Now we can show them different versions of the future and show that the decisions that we're making are the right ones, and they're a very strong investment, even if it's quite a lot of upfront capital costs. It's got that long-term value built into it.
Thanks, Claire. Another question from Danielle. Carl and Pete talked just then about needing to build different types, tenures of housing. Given the West Midlands needs to build 215,000 new homes by 2031 to meet future housing economic demand, are there particular segments of the market you'd like to see more sector capacity anchored around, or certain gaps in supply spatially which your keen partners look at? Don't see any particular hands go up there.
I think we're supposed to say that we want streets with trees on, aren't we? That's a government. Anyway, moving on swiftly from that. I mean, I actually think, for our role is, I think it's really important we're clear on what our role in society is. And I'd see LNG's role as more to be asking exactly that question and then trying to step up to meet the need. We've got later living division, affordable housing division. We can fund housing partnerships with councils. We've got Carla, all within the LNG stable. And the question is kind of which ones of those do you want to have working in your area? Which ones meet the need for housing? And I know you had conversations with different councils in the West Midlands. Some of them don't really want shared ownership, for example. They think they've probably got enough shared ownership. What they really want is social rent and
yep.
executive housing. So part of the vision behind LNG, bringing all those housing divisions together, is to try to be able to answer that question. But as I say, this isn't about LNG, and housing associations have a really important role to play. if some of the other institutions step up, I'm sure they will as well. So
I think that's really fair. I mean, one of the things that we spend a lot of time looking, particularly with the work that we're doing for local authorities, is actually the gaps, and where we think there may be gaps that, as a result of your custodial and future requirements to create legacies for the places that you look after, that actually, steering people and the private sector to help fill those gaps is really, really important. And Neil, I know you had your hand up earlier, and I sort of stepped in, but are there opportunities for people to help you fill those gaps, and what do you see those gaps as being?
I think, to be honest, it's a bit of a cop-out, but the answer is yes to everything. It really, I mean, I
thought it would be, Neil. I thought it would be.
But I mean, that is the challenge of the West Midlands to some degree. It's not a homogenous place by any stretch of the imagination. We've got some significant challenges in terms of family housing provision, but equally, as Pete said, in terms of later care. Each of the local authorities have a slightly different view and a slightly different requirement, which is something we're trying to navigate on a regional basis. But to your point, we certainly do need help. There's no doubt that the scale of the challenge remains huge and will only get bigger. And it also leads us back into that net zero challenge, because we've got a retrofit challenge. It's not all about new development. So that at one level it's a huge opportunity. At another level, it's a bit of a headache for us, because it's not as easy to say these are the gaps across the patch. The Coventry market is very different from the Birmingham city centre market to the Wolverhampton market, or indeed other parts of the Black Country. But to answer Daniela, the answer is definitely yes, and we certainly would welcome conversations with anybody that can help us address some of these gaps.
Thanks, Neil. Another question from David. There's some discussion about public sector and local authorities, but what do the panel think about the future role of Homes England?
Katie, if I can start to pick that up, I think as the last question posed, the West Midlands has got a really serious and significant target for new homes, and Homes England has to play a part in that. It is about bringing all the tools out of the toolkit and making sure that you use them to deliver. And to me, Homes England's major success across the West Midlands has been its involvement in brownfield sites. And that's not just previously developed sites, that is really badly contaminated sites that need a significant amount of upfront infrastructure and investment before they can even start to become development sites themselves. And that's where I think Homes England have really helped the West Midlands in the past, and hopefully they'll continue that into the future.
Thanks, Carl. I think you were cracking up. From just a question really from me addressed, and I know Carl and Neil to a degree did say something earlier in the session. Just we've talked a lot about housing, but there's lots of other opportunities and lots of other growing sectors other than the housing sector for inward investment and indeed general investment. Neil, what sectors are really exciting to you to see that West Midlands can call their own and really see potential growth for?
So I think Carl probably touched on this right at the very start, that our traditional manufacturing sectors have accelerated remarkably over recent years, and they in themselves are creating huge, by far the biggest development sector for us right the way through the pandemic has been, industrial and logistics. And, it's no secret that we are working very hard to get at least one gigafactory into the West Midlands, and working very closely with our OEMs and our supply chain. So in that whole area, I think there is considerable opportunity. I also don't think we should lose sight of how resilient the commercial market has been despite all the challenges. And anybody walking around Birmingham city centre today still sees the cranes and the sites. And I do think we are continuing to see a sort of north shoring which really came from Brexit. I think people looked under the bonnet on what their footprints were in global cities and thought, well, should we be moving or should we be managing our risk? And I think COVID has only accelerated the thinking around that. I talked about hub and spoke, and we're seeing more commercial focus and business hubs outside some of the traditional areas. I think the final point is, again, it's no secret, but within the next few weeks, we'll hear from government quite significant shifts of departmental moves to a range of UK cities, in Birmingham and indeed the West Midlands will feature quite heavily in that, and that in itself will become a significant opportunity on the commercial development side. So we remain pretty optimistic actually around commercial development, particularly in our larger cities, but also I think on the industrial side. For us, so some of our more nascent sectors are regeneration catalysts in their own right. So we talk about creative technologies. It's interesting that we've got a games hub in Leamington, and that the media production sector has continued to work through the pandemic digitally. That has now created a very different approach to how we make television and how we make film, and we hope to utilize that with Stephen Knight, the creator of Peaky Blinders, building Mercian Studios in Digbeth in Birmingham, and the notion of a multi-media creative quarter, which comes from that nascent sector, which will have housing provision and hopefully an independent retail provision as well. So we're trying to ensure that the areas where we do have we do see growth can help the broader regeneration of our region as well.
Thanks, Neil. We're moving towards the end, but one of the questions that I think that would be really interesting to understand, and it may be almost from someone looking from an investment point of view, and this is an open to everyone on the panel, what are the key messages that set the West Midlands apart, and the opportunities that you find that there are for people to come and invest in across the whole piece? What are the key messages that differentiate us in the West Midlands?
I guess I better start because it's my job, really. I would just focus on three things, really. I've touched on the first quite a bit, which is, the region has, by accident or design, moved itself very swiftly into the sectors of the markets where there is going to be opportunity in the world. And the bottom line is fundamentally there needs to be business opportunity for anybody to invest in, and I think we've got those fundamentals right. The second thing I touched on right at the very start, which is a young and growing population and a diverse population in itself creates opportunities. It also creates challenges, but it creates huge investment opportunities, particularly in the real estate market. And the third is the point I made earlier on around infrastructure. I mean, I cannot emphasize enough the level of infrastructure that's going into this region. When I arrived in Birmingham many moons ago, the only thing everybody talked about was transport, but very much in a negative sense. The reality is now the primary and the tertiary transport infrastructure investments have, without doubt, created probably the biggest real estate opportunities that the region's had in a generation or two.
Thanks, Neil. Any other messages from the other panelists? Pete?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's the ability to enter into those kind of collaborative partnerships that I spoke about earlier. If L&G's social role is to identify the need for investment in a place and create partnerships that will drive that, then that's how we're going to be able to invest to achieve our business aims in the West Midlands, fundamentally. So I've got a very long list of things we've looked at in the West Midlands, and things like Arden Cross seem to come forward very, very slowly. So we need to see the rubber hit the road on a few of those, and there's lots of potential. We've been funding, we're well over £1 billion now of funding for these cabinet office hubs for the Government Property Agency and others, but that could be funding for a new gigafactory, or something like that instead. We've just done 210 million with Oxford University. The money is there, it's ready to be tapped up to have that social impact. It's these kind of collaborative partnerships that are going to actually unlock it for impact locally, and different local authorities are better at that than others are.
We do need to give somebody else a chance though, Pete.
Yeah, I know. Carl.
I just pick up on the one word that Neil used, which is diversity. I think for the West Midlands, it's about diversity of our demographics. So that's a great opportunity in itself, particularly when you look at life sciences and testing within markets, but also diversity of opportunity. There is a huge amount of difference between Wolverhampton and Birmingham and Coventry and the towns within the West Midlands, and a huge amount of potential in there. So it doesn't really matter what you're looking for, what sort of opportunity you want to get into. There is something here for you to come and take a look at.
Claire?
I'm slightly looking at it from the outside, but coming back to Pete's point about the partnerships and then the work that we've been doing, combined with the youth, the diversity, the entrepreneurial spirit, the word that kept springing to mind is pivot, this agility in the partnerships. You may have set out to do one thing, but if you've got the trust there, you can change on a dime-ish to seek something else, because the world is at the moment pretty disruptive and things are changing. So if you've got those ingredients that mean that you can change and seek something new because you've seen that the value now exists over there, whereas you thought it was there, I think there are masses of ingredients for that in the West Midlands.
I couldn't agree more. And I think that, from my perspective, Pete mentioned Arden Cross, when you look at those opportunities with the new high-speed rail, the railway and the NEC, that is just a super opportunity. Probably one of the best sites in the country when you look at it on the scale of the opportunity like that. Really exciting. Those are the sorts of things that I get really excited about. I'd like to draw it to a close now. I think just from what we've heard, it's absolutely clear that the West Midland fundamentals remain strong, with lots of growing sectors and lots of sectors which are going to be really important as we grow out perhaps into a kind of greener out of this pandemic economy. It obviously remains open and welcoming to invest in there, and it invests with the private sector. And there are opportunities to capture that investment. I think that's the really important thing, to make it easy for investors to come and do business. So I'd like to thank you all for your support and your experts' insight this afternoon. It's been good, it's been great. I hope we've answered all of the questions that were posed. One final thing that I need to ask of everyone is that there will be a short survey popping up on your screens very shortly, and it would be great for your feedback. And please be kind. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye, everybody.